The church bells of Nether Wallop struck 11, their chimes swallowed by the thick Dorset mist that clung like damp wool to the hedgerows. It was the kind of morning that encouraged silence, the kind of silence that made the scream all the more terrible. Reverend Josiah Merton, a man of tidy habits and an aversion to hysteria, had been preparing his Sunday sermon when the cry echoed from the east wing of his rectory. The scream was high and brittle, and it froze him mid-quotation. When he arrived at the door of the small sitting room, it was already ajar. Inside stood Mrs. Pembroke, his housekeeper, pale as milk and swaying like a sapling in wind. Her apron was clutched to her mouth. And on the Aubusson rug, sprawled with unseemly inelegance, lay the visitor they'd received not an hour before, Sir Geoffrey Hardlaw, Baronet of Upper Shrawley and benefactor of the village's new school roof. He was unmistakably dead. The poker from the hearth had not just been used. It had been employed with a fury rarely seen in Dorset, or perhaps anywhere outside Dante's circles of hell. His skull bore the clear and ghastly signature of murder, yet it wasn't the violence that made the crime unusual. It was the single item left neatly on the writing desk beside the body, a polished child's marble, translucent blue, gleaming in the pale light like the eye of a glass serpent. The local constabulary, summoned promptly by Reverend Merton, was entirely out of its depth. Inspector Grimsby of Hampshire Police did what he could, which was mainly to pace and mutter very irregular indeed. There was no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, no witnesses, except a woman so rattled she could hardly name the day. No motive, either. Sir Geoffrey had arrived unannounced, intending only a brief visit to inspect the parish accounts he funded. His leather folio was still intact on the side table, not a single paper disturbed. Nothing appeared stolen. It was, as the inspector grimly noted, as though the devil himself had walked through the wall, struck the baronet, and walked out again. It was at that point, with the mist still heavy and the corpse cooling rapidly, that Lord Peter Wimsey arrived, clad in a storm-gray overcoat with a lapel carnation that somehow refused to droop. Lord Peter brought with him the faint scent of expensive cologne and a sharper, more electric presence. He'd been summoned not officially, but by mutual acquaintanceship. Sir Geoffrey had once been a client of Wimsey's solicitor, and the news had traveled quickly through certain social channels. Wimsey looked over the scene with the air of a man assessing a play. From the third row, hands behind his back, gaze attentive but not unkind, he crouched beside the body, examining the peculiar angle of the neck, the arc of blood spray, the heavy poker lying slightly off-center. Unusual choice of weapon, he murmured, lifting the poker an inch with a gloved finger. Blunt, brutal, personal, wouldn't you say, Inspector? Grimsby humphed. You might call it that, though I'd say the marble's the more curious bit. Indeed. Wimsey stepped to the desk, lifting the marble delicately, quite out of place in this sort of decor, not the sort of thing a baronet carries for luck. No children in the house, I take it? None. Just the Reverend Mrs. Pembroke and the maid Letty. Wimsey's eyebrows danced. Letty, diminutive. Of Letitia, I presume. Might I have a word? Letty was 17, soft-voiced and red-eyed, her hands twisting the hem of her apron. She'd been dusting the library when the scream rang out, and she swore she'd seen no one come or go. She'd never met Sir Geoffrey before that morning and had no reason to harm him. Yet her eyes lingered a second too long on the marble when Wimsey showed it to her. You've seen this before, he asked gently. She hesitated. My brother, he used to have a set like that. Before he died. Wimsey tilted his head. A local boy? Simon Rudge, she said quietly. Died last year. Drowned in the quarry pond. They said it was an accident. The marble glinted in the overcast light. Wimsey made a soft sound, part musing, part intrigue. Children don't often drown carrying polished marbles in their pockets, not unless they were playing alone, and Simon wasn't the solitary type, was he? Letty looked startled. No, sir. Always with the others, Ralph, and Billy from the farm, and Mr. Harding's son, the baronet. It was the first time anyone had linked Sir Geoffrey to the dead child. Wimsey turned, his gaze sharpening. Hardley's son, Roger, was it? Yes, sir. But he's been gone since, well, Since Simon died, his father sent him to boarding school, a hasty departure. Letty nodded. Wimsey crossed back to the desk, studying the marble again. It begins to fit together. A game gone wrong, a child's secret, an old man cleaning up what his son began. Inspector Grimsby snorted. You're suggesting Sir Geoffrey killed the boy and was then murdered in turn? No, Wimsey said, his voice cool and measured. I'm suggesting Sir Geoffrey paid to cover up a secret that refused to stay buried. Someone knew about the drowning, knew it wasn't an accident. Someone who wanted justice or vengeance. He gestured at the scene, the rug, the poker, the blue marble. This wasn't theft. It wasn't madness. It was reckoning. But who? I don't know yet, said Wimsey. But we're not looking for a criminal. We're looking for someone who loved a little boy so much they kept a piece of his world as a symbol. Someone close, too close to be a stranger. And outside, the mist thickened, swallowing up the hedges, the graveyard, and the quarry pond beyond, silent, deep, and full of old secrets. Lord Peter Wimsey remained by the desk longer than seemed necessary, the blue marble balanced in his palm. Its presence had the weight of symbolism, yet its message remained elusive. The room had not changed. Since the body was removed, Inspector Grimsby saw no need for subtlety, and the constables had tramped through with boots still wet from the mist. But to Wimsey's eye, the room was a symphony of discordant notes. Would you mind terribly, Inspector, he asked lightly, if I borrowed your scene of crime photographs? Grimsby blinked, then muttered, they're still being developed. Pity, said Wimsey, turning his gaze toward the hearth. There was a tray here, wasn't there? Tea for two. The Reverend was kind enough to mention it. Yes. Pembroke set it out before he arrived, said the visitor. Declined, though. Preferred whiskey. Bit early, if you ask me. But the English gentry has a different clock entirely. He moved closer to the tray on the low table, untouched, except his fingers hovered over the jam pot. Do you see, Inspector? There's a smudge here. Someone reached for this after the toast was laid. I hardly think that's murder evidence. No, indeed. But it suggests a third presence. He turned his head slightly. You said Sir Geoffrey arrived alone, yet there's no hat or coat belonging to him. Only his cane left neatly by the sideboard. But the mist was thick. Even the shortest stroll would dampen wool and felt. Where are his belongings? Grimsby frowned. Could have left them in the hallway, or the car. There was no car. That much, the Reverend swears. He arrived on foot. That's half a mile from the village. Precisely, murmured Wimsey, now staring at the floor with renewed attention. He stepped lightly across the rug, then knelt, pushing back its edge to reveal the polished boards beneath. May I trouble you for a torch, Inspector? With a mutter, Grimsby produced one. Wimsey shone it along the baseboard near the hearth and smiled. Here's our misplaced object. A button, rather small, not from the baronet's coat he was wearing. Tweed. This is dark velvet, I should say. Evening wear, but curiously domestic. Grimsby snorted. Could have come loose any time. Or it could have come from someone who visited last night, not this morning. Grimsby turned toward the door, annoyed. Reverend Merton said Sir Geoffrey arrived at 10 today. Pembroke saw him. It's not as if Mrs. Pembroke saw a man she thought was Sir Geoffrey. Wimsey corrected gently. In mist like this, and with memory primed to expect him, wouldn't most assume it was he. The housekeeper was fetched again. Her nerves had steadied slightly, though her eyes still darted between Wimsey and the hearth as if she feared the poker might rise of its own accord. Forgive me, madam, Wimsey said softly, but you said you saw Sir Geoffrey at 10. Did he greet you? She nodded. Yes, m'lord. Came in polite. Took his usual tone, said he needed a quiet look at the accounts. Did you see his face clearly? Well, not perfectly. He kept his hat on. I was cleaning the stair rail, so he passed quick. And his voice, was it familiar? She faltered. I assumed it sounded rougher than usual, but I thought he was just poorly. Wimsey nodded. Kindly. Thank you. One last thing, did he bring his own whiskey? No, sir. He poured it from the decanter in the study. Was it full this morning? She hesitated again. Nearly. But now it's only a third left. Wimsey smiled. I see. After she departed, Wimsey turned to Grimsby. This wasn't a morning crime. This was staged to appear as one. The true events occurred hours earlier. But why stage it at all? To obscure the killer's identity and perhaps to give him time to leave undetected. Grimsby folded his arms. All this still doesn't tell us who killed the baronet. No, said Wimsey. But it tells us he wasn't killed in a burst of passion. He was lured here, late at night, likely under false pretenses, and struck down with precision. Whoever did it was calm enough to tidy, remove the body temporarily, and return it by morning. Return it? Grimsby stared. You're saying the body was moved? The blood has dried unevenly beneath the rug. The stains suggest it was lifted and returned. Grimsby turned pale. You're suggesting someone removed a corpse, then returned it just to confuse us, to delay suspicion, possibly to arrange an alibi. Think of it. A locked house, a dead man apparently arrived hours after he was already dead. If you were clever and knew the habits of those living here, wouldn't it be possible? Wimsey walked slowly to the window and looked out into the mist-smeared garden. Beyond the hedgerow, the old quarry path curved toward the pond, now invisible in the white fog. Someone knew how to manipulate appearances. Someone with intimate knowledge of the house, the staff's routine, and the identity of the last visitors. Here, Grimsby rubbed his forehead. Which brings us back to the boy, doesn't it? Wimsey nodded. Simon Rudge, drowned under mysterious circumstances. And now, months later, a baronet lies bludgeoned beside a marble he could never have known existed. A knock interrupted them. A constable stepped in, slightly out of breath. Sir, there's someone asking for you. Says he's a journalist. Bit persistent. Send him in. Grimsby growled. And if he so much as takes a photo. But the man who entered was not the sort to be cowed by warnings. He was tall, gray at the temples, dressed in a sharp wool overcoat and muddy shoes, as though he had walked a great way and enjoyed every step of it. His manner was casual, but his eyes were sharp, watchful. Name's Penley, he said with a faint northern accent. Trevor Penley. I write for the Illustrated Chronicle. I don't suppose you've found the boy's ghost yet. Wimsey tilted his head. You knew Simon Rudge. Covered the case last year. Penley said. It never sat right with me. Too quick, too quiet. No inquest worth the name. Rich man's son walks away scot-free. And the village folds in like a bad map. Didn't expect to see another corpse. Though, Wimsey smiled without humor, nor did we. But perhaps now, at last, someone wants the truth unearthed. Outside, the fog began to lift, layer by reluctant layer, revealing shapes in the landscape that had seemed to vanish. The leaning fence post, the half-buried garden path, and at last, in the distance, the glint of still water. Lord Peter watched it, thoughtful. Inspector, he said, have someone check the gravel walk just beyond the study window. I expect they'll find wheel tracks, and if I'm not mistaken, they won't match any known vehicle in the village. Grimsby nodded stiffly and departed. Penley turned to Wimsey. You think this is revenge? No, said Wimsey softly. Revenge is messy. This was justice disguised as chance. The morning wore on, the mist thinning into strands, leaving behind a slick sheen on the flagstones and a faint chill. In the air, Lord Peter Wimsey remained in the drawing room of the rectory, his gaze drifting across the space as if listening for echoes that might still linger in the walls. Outside, boots crunched over gravel as constables combed the grounds. The Reverend Merton, nervous and guilt-stricken simply by association, returned from his brief retreat in the vestry to find Lord Peter seated comfortably with a notebook in his lap and a half-smile on his face. Ah, Reverend, Wimsey greeted gently. I wonder if I might trouble you for a few minutes. I find myself increasingly curious about last evening. Did you, by chance, see or hear anything after dark? Unusual footsteps, a visitor. The Reverend clasped his hands. Well, nothing. That seemed unusual at the time. I retired to my room at 9, after supper. I did hear the gate creak at some point. It does so when the latch isn't fastened. But I thought it merely the wind. The house settles so noisily in damp weather. Understandable. But you didn't see anyone, no, said Merton, shaking his head. No visitors were expected. Sir Geoffrey wrote a fortnight ago to say he'd come this morning. That was all. Forgive me for pressing, but your note from him, do you still have it? I believe so. The Reverend rose and crossed to his bureau, rifling through papers until he extracted a cream-colored sheet with Sir Geoffrey's heavy hand. Wimsey studied it briefly. Ink slightly smeared. A left-handed man, was he? I believe he was right-handed. Curious. This letter was written by a left hand quite deliberately, but not confidently. Look here, see how the loops. Close laid on the downstroke. Someone trying to disguise their writing. Reverend Merton blanched. You think this letter is forged? I think someone wanted you to believe Sir Geoffrey would arrive this morning. That means they anticipated this very scene, and that, Reverend, requires an intimate knowledge of this household's schedule. They were interrupted by the return of Inspector Grimsby, his boots damp and his brow furrowed. You were right about the tracks, he said without preamble. There's a narrow tire-marked bicycle, maybe with a cart on the side path near the study window. Someone used the back garden entrance last night. A cart, murmured Wimsey, tapping the notebook. Ideal for moving a body discreetly. And what's more, it suggests the killer was either very strong or had assistance. He stood. Let's speak to the staff again. I believe Letty, our maid, has more to say. Letty was brought in. Face pale and strained, Wimsey gestured. Kindly for her to sit. Letty, when we last spoke, you mentioned Simon had a group of friends. You named 3 boys, Ralph, Billy, and young Roger Hardla. Did they all live nearby? Yes, sir. Ralph's father is the blacksmith. Billy's family runs the dairy. And did you see Simon that day? The day he died, she swallowed. I wasn't meant to, but I followed them down the quarry path. I saw them play by the pond. Then I ran home. I never thought. Her voice broke. You saw them all there, all 4 boys, yes. They were tossing stones and marbles, skipping them over the water. And what of Roger? Did he leave with the others? Letty hesitated. No, sir. He lingered. You're sure? Her eyes welled. He had this look, like he was afraid of something, or angry. I don't know. But he didn't follow when the others went. Wimsey nodded gravely. Thank you, Letty. You've been very brave. When she had gone, Grimsby gave him a sharp glance. So Roger stays behind, and Simon ends up dead. You think he pushed him? I think something happened, perhaps by accident, and Roger never spoke of it. Perhaps his father covered it up, sent him away. And now, a year later, someone is unburying the truth. Wimsey turned his attention next to the housekeeper. Mrs. Pembroke reappeared, stiff with dignity but clearly on edge. Mrs. Pembroke, Wimsey said gently, tell me, did Sir Geoffrey ever visit you here alone, prior to today? She blinked. No, he'd meet the Reverend here for accounts. That's all. Did you know his son? I've seen him once or twice, but the boy never came in. Bit of a sullen child, always looking away. Do you remember if he had a limp? She paused. Yes. Now that you mention it, he favored. His left leg fell from a pony once, I heard. Wimsey gave a small nod. Curious. There were faint impressions in the soil beyond the back gate bootprints, one lighter than the other. Someone limping. And yet, no one here has a limp. Her composure faltered. Well, what are you suggesting? That someone with knowledge of the house returned last night. Someone who may have followed a different path in the dark. She didn't answer. The final conversation of the morning was with young Ralph Jewson, the blacksmith's boy, now 17, and someone from the forge with soot still under his nails. He looked nervous but defiant, eyeing the drawing room as though it might accuse him. Wimsey offered him a seat. Ralph, tell me, did you see Simon the day he died? Ralph's eyes narrowed. We all did. It was just mucking about. He slipped. That's what they said. But did you see it? A long pause. Then, no, I'd gone early. I had chores, and Billy, he left with me. Roger and Simon stayed, said they were going to play war games. Did Roger ever talk about it after? Ralph shrugged. Didn't get the chance. He was packed off to Sussex the next morning. Wimsey tapped his pencil thoughtfully. That was rather fast, wasn't it? Ralph didn't answer. When he was dismissed, Grimsby shook his head. Too many versions of the same story. And none of them clean, no, said Wimsey. But the lies are unraveling. Each one bears a small flaw, like thread pulled from the hem of a garment. Eventually the whole coat falls apart. He returned to the writing desk, where the marble still sat. Picking it up, He held it to the light once. More, someone kept this for a year. Not as a trophy but as a reminder. Grimsby frowned. You think it's the key? I think it's a message, said Whimsy. Someone wants us to see that the past never truly died, it just lay waiting. And now it's speaking again, in polished blue and silence, outside. A crow called once harshly, and then the stillness returned. The marble remained on the desk, inert but heavy with meaning, as if daring them to look beyond its smooth surface. Lord Peter Wimsey turned it slowly in his fingers, while Inspector Grimsby paced the room, frustrated by the lack of a clear suspect. Outside, the fog had all but vanished, revealing the squat gravestones of the churchyard and the lonely pond in the near distance, glinting with deceptive calm. We've 3 boys now, men who were there that day, Grimsby muttered. 1 vanished to Sussex. 1 keeps his mouth shut. 1 tells the truth only when pressed. That boy's death, it must be connected. It is, said Whimsy quietly. But the connection doesn't lie in the accident alone. It lies in what was hidden afterward. The baronet's murder is not just an act of vengeance. It's a message. Grimsby stopped pacing. And who, exactly, do you think sent it? I think, Whimsy replied, we should speak to the man who vanished, Roger Hardlaw. That boy's father was rich enough to send him off before the inquest, and discreet enough to keep him hidden. We've got no address, but journalists have long memories, said Whimsy. Let's ask our friend Penley where to begin. They found Penley at the village pub, poring over his old clippings. He looked up as they approached, his eyes sharp. Hardlaw, he said, disappeared the day after Simon died. The family claimed he'd gone to convalesce from a nervous condition. They called in a private doctor, said the boy was unstable. Convenient, Whimsy murmured. And where did they send him? Shropshire, I believe, some country. Retreat for young men of fragile health. I remember because I tried to speak to him there was told he wasn't taking visitors. Was he ever questioned formally? Once, at the time of the death, he claimed Simon slipped, but it was done behind closed doors. His father saw to that. Whimsy thanked him and returned to the rectory with renewed urgency. By afternoon, telegrams had been dispatched and the wheels of official inquiry began to turn. Meanwhile, he began to lay out the pieces of the puzzle not with drama, but with method. The motives, he knew, would lead them to the murderer's heart. Simon Rudge, a boy with no family, had drowned in a pond surrounded by peers. That much was clear. But none of the surviving boys could or would explain how. One left the village, the other stayed, but kept their answers vague. Now, a year later, Sir Geoffrey, father to the most silent of the 3, was dead, bludgeoned and displayed like a warning. Let's look again at who benefits. Whimsy murmured to himself, not just from the murder but from the illusion of it being recent. He returned to the study and began reviewing the statements. Mrs. Pembroke's loyalty, near defensive. The Reverend's bafflement. Letty's fear. Ralph's guarded resentment. And then there was Billy, whose father, Mr. Price, the dairyman, had yet to be questioned directly. By late afternoon, Whimsy and Grimsby paid a call to the dairy farm. Mr. Price met them in the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Can't say I know much more than Billy told you, he said. Boys went to the pond. 1 came back dead. My lad came back quiet with guilt. Asked Whimsy gently. No, Price said sharply, with fear. He saw something that scared him stiff, but he swore to me he didn't see how Simon died, but he kept a secret. Price's jaw tensed. He said Roger pushed Simon, said they were playing a game, and it turned rough. But Roger didn't mean to hurt him. He panicked, ran, didn't even check if Simon was alive. And your son told no one. Price exhaled. I wanted to go to the authorities, but when the Hardlaw family stepped in, everything changed. They blamed Simon, said he'd gone off alone. There was money, pressure. You understand? Whimsy nodded. And did your son accept it? No, it's eaten at him all year, especially when the marbles started showing up. Whimsy paused, started. Price looked surprised. You didn't know? There were 3. First one was found in the church porch, then another outside the forge. Each time, someone who was there that day found a blue marble with a smear of red paint. Meant nothing to the villagers, but my boy understood. Whimsy felt the chill crawl up his spine. A warning, or a call to conscience, Price said grimly. I told him to stay quiet, but he went to see Sir Geoffrey tonight's ago, said he'd had enough. Whimsy stiffened. He confronted Sir Geoffrey. Price nodded, told him the truth had to come out, and the old man said nothing, just stared. Back at the rectory, Whimsy sat in the study once more. The web tightening. Now the motive began to take shape. Not only revenge for Simon's death, but guilt, festering and unspoken. Billy had cracked. Letty remembered. Ralph saw what he wasn't meant to. And Sir Geoffrey. He held the secret like a stone in his pocket, too heavy to carry, too damning to drop. And then there was Roger. Penley, Whimsy asked that evening, can you find Roger Hardlaw? Penley gave a slow nod. Already tried. He's not in Shropshire anymore. He left 3 weeks ago. No word since. And the family? Closed ranks. Whimsy looked out at the pond again, now dark under moonlight. He's here, somewhere near. Why come back? Penley asked. Whimsy's answer was quiet. Because guilt is a leash, and shame, a silent scream. Perhaps Roger returned to confess. Perhaps someone brought him back, or perhaps he came to stop someone else from doing so. There was a knock. Grimsby stepped in, the prints on the window latch, not Sir Geoffrey's, too small, and the decanter wiped clean. Whimsy stood. That's it. We've danced with the past long enough. The marbles, the button, the limping prints, the forged letter. Someone staged a scene to protect a lie and killed to ensure it stayed buried. Grimsby stared. Who? Someone clever. Someone who knew where to strike and when. Whimsy turned slowly, voice low. We have one suspect left. Not a boy, a man. One who stayed too silent, too long. Grimsby narrowed his eyes. Billy, no, said Whimsy. The Reverend. He knew everything, and never once asked the right questions. Morning broke with a thin, sharp wind rattling the window panes. At the rectory, the mood was no longer one of somber confusion, but of focused intensity. Inspector Grimsby had acted quickly following Lord Peter's suspicion of the Reverend. Before noon, the Reverend had been quietly brought into the station for questioning, his expression stunned, his lips tightly sealed. In his study, a loose floorboard had yielded what seemed to be damning evidence. A small bundle wrapped in linen, a child's blue marble, red paint smudged faintly across it, and an iron paperweight of curious design, matching the wounds found on Sir Geoffrey's skull. Can't be coincidence, Grimsby said triumphantly as he laid the paperweight on the table in the drawing room. He had means, motive, and now look at this opportunity. He wasn't in his bed the night of the murder. Letty heard footsteps on the stairs after midnight. Whimsy stared at the item without touching it. And yet, he murmured, it's too neat. Grimsby frowned. You're not convinced. I'm never convinced by something that falls into place too easily. The Reverend Merton may have been passive, morally so, but a killer. He hasn't the spine. Grimsby scoffed. The weak often do the desperate, given reason. Agreed, Whimsy said, but reason must fit the shape of the deed. Murder staged with dramatic flair. A message embedded in marble. It doesn't feel like him. Nevertheless, the village responded as one might expect. Word spread fast. The parson had killed the baronet. In the pub, they muttered of hidden guilt and pent-up remorse. In the shops, they whispered about how silence had always clung to the rectory too tightly. The newspapers caught scent by afternoon, and Penley, now joined by 2 more reporters, began typing furiously beneath the pub's low-beamed ceiling. Whimsy remained behind, not celebrating. He sat by the pond, watching the water's quiet surface, his eyes distant, hands loosely folded on his walking stick. There was something in the timing, something false in the symmetry. Back at the constable's office, Merton sat alone. He had neither confessed nor denied. He simply looked stunned, wounded by the betrayal of his own house. The evidence had spoken, they said, but Whimsy's instincts resisted it. Letty, when questioned again, grew more uncertain. Did you see the Reverend come down? Whimsy asked. She hesitated. I heard the creak and the door latch. I assumed. Assumptions have hung many an innocent man, Whimsy murmured. Tell me, the bundle, did anyone else have access to his study? She paled. Mrs. Pembroke cleans there. She dusts everything. That evening, Whimsy returned. To the scene, the paperweight, now stored in an evidence bag, still bore no clear fingerprints. The marble blue, red-smeared, unmistakably like the others sat beside it. It was too much. Too theatrical, too deliberate. He called on Mrs. Pembroke. Once more. She opened the door with hands red from polishing and a strangely calm expression. As if preparing for something, Mrs. Pembroke, Whimsy said lightly, "I wanted to thank you for your cooperation. We've come a long way." She offered a tight nod. "Glad to help. You've served the household for many years, haven't you? 16 this spring. And yet no one quite remembers where you were the night Sir Geoffrey arrived." Her eyes flickered. "I was in bed. No one saw you. I don't disturb the house when it sleeps. But you clean the Reverend's study, do you not? Daily." Whimsy stepped further in. "Then tell me, did you ever find a marble there before?" She stiffened. "Just slightly. No, sir. No little blue glass beads, not even one placed, say, behind a loose floorboard?" Her composure cracked then. It was the smallest twitch of the mouth, but Whimsy saw it. "You're fond of the Reverend," he continued. "You believe he's weak, that he let Simon die, that he didn't protect the boy. And now you think his failure cost Sir Geoffrey his life. So, perhaps, you decided to give him motive, to make sense of it all, isn't that right?" She looked away. "You have no proof, only the shape of your grief," Whimsy said quietly. "It's very specific. You're not angry that a child died, you're angry that it was that child. A poor boy, a boy without a title." Her silence was answer enough. When he left her, it was not in handcuffs, for she had not killed anyone, not directly. But she had hidden the marble in the Reverend's study. She had found it weeks ago, left in the porch, and kept it when Sir Geoffrey's body was discovered. She had panicked or schemed and planted it where it would make the most noise. But that still left one question unresolved. Who killed Sir Geoffrey? The marble planted in the rectory was not the marble found at the scene. It was one of the earlier ones, likely taken from the church. The paperweight could have been touched by many hands, and yet the murder itself, blunt, precise, staged, had required planning. Late that night, Whimsy returned to the pond. He stood at its edge, letting the wind scrape against his coat. The moon illuminated a faint path once used by the boys, now grown over. He crouched and studied the dirt. There a scuff mark, and beside it, the faint impression of a stick or cane. A walking stick. But the Reverend didn't carry one, neither did Billy nor Ralph. But someone had returned, recently, someone who limped. He rose slowly, breath catching. Roger. The marble had not been left by the murderer to taunt the living. It had been a warning, not from the killer but to him. And now, with the Reverend arrested, the village would believe the matter closed. The real killer still watching, still waiting, could now act again. UNBOTHERED. It was a false victory, and the shadows round the pond felt suddenly colder. The wind pushed harder against the village rooftops as dusk fell, as though it to sense the case was anything but solved. Whimsy lingered near the pond, staring not at the water but at the uneven earth around it, the scuff mark, the cane-like impression, too recent, too precise. And there had only been one man in recent memory who'd limped through Penberry Hollow with such a tread. Roger. The name had hardly come up since the first day. Roger Collins, eldest son of the old schoolmaster, long gone from Penberry and long unspoken of. He'd left after a bitter scandal nearly 2 decades ago. Theft from the church poor box, whispers of inappropriate conduct toward village girls, a burning row with Sir Geoffrey. Some said he'd vanished to London, others said he'd died in France. But now, Whimsy wondered if the village had simply forgotten him on purpose. He made his way back to the rectory and asked the Reverend Merton one last question before Grimsby could ship him off to Dorchester. Roger Collins, did he ever return to Penberry in recent years? Merton frowned from his bench. Not to my knowledge. He was excommunicated in effect. If not by doctrine, I suppose the villagers found it easier not to speak of him. But he would have reason to resent Sir Geoffrey. Oh, most certainly. Geoffrey was the one who had him banished, in all but name, accused him publicly of corrupting the choir boys, then beat him bloody in front of the church when Roger struck back with claims of his own. Whimsy's brows twitched. Claims, yes, Roger accused Geoffrey of, shall we say, entertaining company in London that wouldn't have passed muster in Penbury. He had letters. Apparently, I don't know whether they were real, Geoffrey always denied it, and no one saw fit to mention this until now. Merton lowered his eyes. We all have pasts, Lord Peter. Some villages choose silence over truth. By morning, Wimsey had made a quiet journey to the local archive office above the library. He sifted through old church records, press clippings, even crumbling school reports. It was there, wedged between reports of the flower festival and a lambing contest, that he found it. Local youth dismissed from school choir in scandal. Beneath the headline was a grainy photograph. Roger Collins, aged 15, standing beside a choir stall, arms folded, eyes defiant. Another name caught his eye. Not Sir Geoffrey's, but Alfred Pembroke, Mrs. Pembroke's late husband. Listed as the choirmaster at the time. Wimsey straightened. Alfred Pembroke had drowned in the Weir 5 years ago. An accident, they said. Slipped during a storm. But if he'd been choirmaster at the time of Roger's disgrace, that placed him directly between Roger and Geoffrey. And if Roger had returned quietly to Penbury, perhaps Alfred's death had not been so accidental after all. He returned to the vicarage, his mind whirring. Letty answered the door with her usual startled flutter. "Letty," he said, "do you remember a man named Roger Collins?" She stiffened, looking instinctively over her shoulder. "You mean the one from the school?" "Yes, do you know if he's returned?" She didn't answer for a long moment. Then, with visible discomfort, she nodded. "A week ago, I saw him. He came round the back door asking for Mrs. Pembroke. Said he needed help. She sent me away." "Did he speak to anyone else?" "No. He left before dark." But she looked shaken. "I asked who he was, and she said he was family. A cousin, maybe." I knew she was lying. Wimsey exhaled through his nose. So Roger had returned, and Mrs. Pembroke had covered for him. That night, he watched the staff cottage from the tree line. The hearth glowed within, but the windows were shuttered tight. Just before midnight, a shadow slipped from the side door, limping, clutching a stick. It crossed the lane toward the path leading out of Penbury, the same path to the pond. Wimsey followed at a distance. The figure paused once, perhaps sensing he was not alone. But then he continued on, turning suddenly not toward the water but toward the old, disused crypt behind the chapel ruins. Inside, Wimsey found the air cold and thick with dust. The man didn't flinch as Wimsey stepped from the shadows. Instead, Roger Collins turned slowly, face older than memory, but eyes still sharp. "You're persistent," he said softly. "I knew someone wouldn't swallow it. The marble," Wimsey said, "wasn't yours to place. You didn't leave it." Roger gave a tight, bitter smile. "No, that was Pembroke's doing. Trying to clean up the mess. You killed Sir Geoffrey." Roger didn't answer immediately. He limped to a stone ledge and sat, setting the cane beside him. "He took everything from me, my future, my home. I came back to ask for an apology. Foolish, I know. I found him near the pond. He didn't recognize me at first. Then he did." Wimsey said nothing. He laughed. "Said I was still filth, still the chore boy who lied. Said he'd have me arrested if I stayed in the county. I didn't plan to kill him, Lord Peter. I truly didn't. But then he grabbed me by the coat. Same as before. Same fury. Same smugness. I had the cane in my hand." He fell. Roger nodded, cracked his head on the edge of the stone. "The rest, I only made it look deliberate. The marble, I admit, was my touch. I had one left from the church, just to confuse them. And Mrs. Pembroke, she found me that night, helped me hide the blood. She's been helping ever since." Wimsey looked at the broken man before him. No bravado, no malice, only decades of bitterness and pain, finally erupting in the shape of a corpse by the pond. "You're going to turn me in," Roger said. Wimsey looked toward the chapel window. Dawn had not yet come. "Not tonight," he said at last. "Tonight. I listen. Tomorrow. We'll see what justice really means for a village that's spent 20 years pretending this never happened." Roger said nothing. Somewhere outside, the wind began again. Not cruel this time, just constant. A quiet reminder that the past never stays buried forever. The morning brought no reprieve. Gray clouds hung low over Penberry Hollow, as if mourning. Truths long buried and now unearthed. Lord Peter Wimsey returned to the manor under the pretense of a final interview with Inspector Grimsby, who was still basking in the glow of his hasty triumph. Roger had slipped away under cover of darkness, and Wimsey made no mention of their meeting, yet. He needed proof not just of the act, but of everything that had led to it. He sat alone in the study with the crime scene photos, Geoffrey's diary, and a stack of village correspondence. He was looking for something not yet obvious, some pattern. And there, tucked in the corner of a photograph from the night of the murder, was something absurdly ordinary, a white feather on Geoffrey's coat lapel. Not a dove's, not a swan's. It looked like one from a barnyard chicken. But Geoffrey kept no birds. That was Letty's domain. Her coop was at the far edge of the property. Wimsey stood. He walked to the kitchen where Letty was preparing stew. Letty, the night of the murder did you go to the henhouse? She looked up sharply. Me no. Sir, not since dusk. Birds were already in. Anyone else might have. She paused, hands stilled. No, I locked the gate after I feed them. Would you recognize if something had disturbed the birds? They raise a racket if anyone gets close. He nodded, letting her return to her work. A feather on Geoffrey's coat. Either someone came from the coop that night, or someone wanted to appear as if they had. Back in the drawing room, Wimsey placed a small white feather on the corner of the tea table, then summoned Mrs. Pembroke and Merton for what he called a final reflection before the coroner's inquest. He'd already slipped a second feather into the fold of Merton's overcoat hanging in the hall. The three sat quietly around the tea service. Wimsey poured with care, speaking of nothing weather, the seasonal hymn choices, the roses, but as he reached for the sugar, he casually brushed the planted feather from the table. Ah, still shedding, he murmured, making no effort to explain what he meant. Mrs. Pembroke glanced once, faintly confused. Merton, however, stiffened. His mouth pressed into a line. Wimsey offered no further comment, only continued to talk, watching as Merton's hand crept slowly to the inside pocket of his coat beside him, then froze, then slowly retracted. Wimsey leaned forward. I imagine a feather like that is nothing to most, but to a man who came through the side hedge, brushing too close to the coop, it must bring back all sorts of memories. Merton's eyes widened for the barest fraction of a second. He recovered, smiling. I'm not sure what you mean. No, you visited Sir Geoffrey that evening. You argued. You struck him once with your cane. The blood on the statue belonged to you, not him. Geoffrey collapsed after Roger confronted him, but you had already left your mark. That's absurd. Not entirely. Roger confronted Geoffrey hours later. The fatal blow was his, yes, but before that, Geoffrey was already unsettled, disoriented, a gash on his scalp, his temper frayed. You claim to have spent the evening at the rectory preparing a sermon. No one saw you. The blood on the marble was not from a head wound, it was from a hand that held a cane. Merton's breathing changed, slight, but telling. Did Geoffrey threaten you? Wimsey pressed. Did he mock the sermons, threaten to expose something? I have nothing to confess, Merton said quietly, though his fingers trembled as he reached for his tea. You said Roger delivered the final blow, Wimsey interrupted. But this was not a single moment of rage. This was a chain of events. You confronted Geoffrey. Then Mrs. Pembroke helped clean up after Roger's outburst. 3 acts in one tragedy, all masked by a marble and a lie. Mrs. Pembroke had grown pale. Are you saying you each played your part? And the marble, well, that was the strangest thing of all. Roger thought it would confuse us. Instead, it made me wonder who might have a reason to leave behind a symbol of childhood lost. He rose, walking toward the door. No one has confessed, not yet. But I suspect none of you truly wish for Roger to take the full blame. I'll give you one more day. Tomorrow, I go to the constabulary. He left them in silence. That evening, he returned to the crypt. Roger was waiting. They know, Roger said simply. They suspect. That's different. Wimsey pulled something from his coat, a ledger, pulled from the rector's office that afternoon. You might want to read page 62. Roger did. His eyes moved across the page. Then he closed the book. They paid him. he said, voice flat. Every year, quietly. Through church repairs, not much, but enough to keep him silent. Roger handed the ledger back. So he was guilty too, perhaps, or afraid, or just complicit by silence. What happens now? Whimsy looked toward the chapel ruins. Now we find out what Penberry does when the truth doesn't fit neatly in a magistrate's report. For the first time since the night of the murder, the village felt quiet, not with the hush of avoidance, but with the weight of revelation pressing down upon it. The following morning dawned cold and damp, with a mist that clung low across the fields and crawled in through the cracks of Penberry Hollow like a quiet warning. Lord Peter Wimsey returned to the rectory just after sunrise. He had made up his mind to present the ledger to Inspector Grimsby, not to implicate Merton directly, but to show the conspiracy that had stitched itself into the very soul of the village. But when he arrived, the rectory's office door stood ajar. That was unusual. Merton was meticulous, particularly about privacy. Wimsey stepped inside, calling out, but the house was silent. The desk was in disarray. Drawers open, papers scattered. The locked drawer where Wimsey had replaced the ledger the night before now hung askew, its contents gone. He stood still for a long moment, gaze narrowing. Whoever had taken it had done so without haste. There were no signs of panic, no toppled furniture or broken locks. This had been careful, intentional, and that meant whoever had done it had known exactly what they were looking for. Wimsey returned to the manor, his mind racing. The missing ledger had been the only concrete tie between Merton and Jeffries. Blackmail. Without it, the motive was intangible, deniable. Even Roger's confession now sounded like a desperate man trying to claim justice, not solve a murder. Wimsey needed another angle, and quickly. Letty greeted him at the door, her face tight with something unspoken. "There's something you ought to know," she said, pulling him toward the drawing room. "This morning, Mrs. Pembroke left, said she was going to visit her sister in Kent. She took the afternoon train. Didn't say goodbye to anyone but the housemaid." Wimsey frowned. "Did she take luggage?" "Yes. To cases, HMM. She left this behind." Letty handed him a slim parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside, to his astonishment, was the original photo of Geoffrey from the morning of his death, the one that had been taken by the village photographer and quietly removed from circulation. For its unflattering portrayal, Wimsey turned the photo over. Scrawled in ink, barely legible, were the words, "He knew everything. I should have said something sooner. Forgive me." He sat down, jaw tight. The photograph had been part of Geoffrey's vanity collection, removed shortly before the funeral. It had shown him looking disheveled, unshaven, and most damningly, wearing the exact coat that bore the white feather, a silent accusation framed in cloth and plumage. And now the photo was the only remaining proof that the coat ever bore it. The coat itself had disappeared after the coroner's inquest. He stared at the image. Someone was cleaning up. Silently, methodically, they were scraping the record clean of every stain. Mrs. Pembroke's departure felt too conveniently timed. He left the manor at once and walked down to the village photographer's shop. Mr. Elkins, a nervous man with thick spectacles, greeted him with wary politeness. "Lord Wimsey, did you come about the order for the coronation portraits?" "No. I'm interested in the negatives from the photograph of Sir Geoffrey, the one taken the morning before he died." Elkins shifted. "Oh, that one. I am afraid it's no longer available. Per Lady Pembroke's instructions, I destroyed the negatives last week." Wimsey's expression did not change. "You're sure of that?" Elkins swallowed. "Quite sure. Burned them in the stove, as she asked. Said it was to preserve his dignity." "Did she offer to pay for your silence as well?" The man paled. No, of course not." Wimsey nodded and left, but the walls of the case were closing in. Every piece of evidence was either vanishing or being rewritten. He returned to the manor, only to find that the child's marble statuette was no longer in the drawing room. Letty stared at the empty pedestal. "It was there this morning," she said. "I dusted it myself, and now no idea. No one's been in all day. Check the cellar," Wimsey said grimly. "And the fire grate." She didn't need to. Later that evening, the staff found it buried at the bottom of the ash heap behind the manor. Shattered. He gathered Roger once more in the chapel ruins. The chill in the air had deepened. They're dismantling everything, Whimsy said. The ledger's gone. Geoffrey's photograph, the original coat, the marble statue destroyed. They're trying to erase the truth before it can solidify. Who? Roger asked. Merton. I think Mrs. Pembroke orchestrated the removal. But not for herself. She's protecting someone. Roger's eyes burned. It was all to protect Geoffrey's name. No. Geoffrey's name is already lost. This is to shield what's left of Penberry's reputation of its peace. And I suspect someone thinks you're expendable enough to pin the whole affair on. Roger stood, pacing beneath the broken archway. So what do? We bait the trap again. But this time, we make it personal. He returned to the manor and wrote a single letter, unsigned, addressed in a broad hand and posted to the next village for delivery. It read, "There's more left than they think. Meet me at the crypt at midnight. Bring what you took or I go to Scotland Yard." He did not say who it was meant for. He simply waited. And as the clock neared midnight, footsteps echoed once more among the stones of Penberry Hollow, where the truth, tattered, bruised, but not yet buried, still waited to be unearthed. Rain had begun to fall by the time Lord Peter Wimsey reached the crypt. The ancient stone doors, half sunken into the moss-laced earth behind the chapel ruins, gave a faint groan as he pushed them open. Inside, the damp air hung heavy with the scent of mold and iron. The flicker of his lantern cast long, trembling shadows along the walls where forgotten plaques bore names now mostly erased by time. He had chosen this place deliberately, hidden, quiet, and in its own way, accusatory. Whoever came tonight would be forced to walk past generations of the Pembroke dead, and perhaps that weight would loosen a tongue or a conscience. Footsteps approached just after midnight. Wimsey turned down the lantern's flame and stood back, watching the silhouette descend the stone steps. For a moment, the figure seemed hesitant, pausing near the threshold. Then it entered fully, lifting a lamp of its own, and he saw the face. It wasn't Mrs. Pembroke, nor was it Merton. It was Letty. For an instant, neither spoke. Her face, pale and glistening from the rain, showed no fear, only resignation. She held a parcel beneath her cloak, square and flat. "You sent the note?" she asked quietly. Wimsey nodded. "I never imagined it would be you. I didn't think you'd suspect," she replied. "But then again, I've always been good at being overlooked." She stepped further into the crypt and placed the parcel on a stone bench. "It's the missing ledger," she said. "I took it the morning after you returned it to Merton." "Why?" "Because I knew it wouldn't stop there," she said. "Geoffrey ruined lives, Peter. I don't say that lightly. When he was murdered, I thought perhaps we were free. But you kept digging. You were going to ruin us all again. So I thought if I destroyed the pieces, it would end. It won't end," he said softly. "Not until the truth is faced." Letty turned away, her jaw set. "And what then? Do we parade our sins through the village square? Have Merton arrested? See Roger hang?" Before Wimsey could respond, a sound interrupted them, a low rustle from the crypt's entrance. They turned in unison. A second figure had entered the crypt. This time, it was Merton. But something was wrong. His face was ghastly pale, his coat soaked, his movements unsteady. He stumbled forward and fell to his knees near the threshold. Wimsey rushed to him, catching him just as he crumpled. Blood soaked through the back of Merton's shirt, a deep wound high on his shoulder blade. Not immediately fatal, but vicious. He came for me," Merton gasped. "I never saw his face, just the blow. I ran. His voice faded as Wimsey lowered him to the stone floor. Letty knelt beside them, pressing her scarf to the wound. "Who did this?" But Merton's eyes had already rolled back. "Not dead, but unconscious." Wimsey stood, jaw tight. "Someone knew we'd be here. Someone who feared Merton might confess or interfere." Lightning cracked overhead. The crypt trembled faintly as thunder rolled above them. Wimsey helped Letty lift Merton to his feet, dragging him toward the rectory through the storm. Every shadow seemed to lurch forward. Every tree in the village loomed like a sentry. Dr. Henshaw was summoned and took Merton into care, shaking his head grimly at the severity of the injury. "He'll live, but barely," the doctor muttered. "If you're looking for your culprit, best do it quickly." This wasn't a warning, it was meant to finish something. Later that night, alone again in the drawing room, Whimsy turned the events over in his mind. Letty, the missing ledger, now returned. Merton, stabbed by an unseen hand. Someone had struck while the focus was elsewhere. Someone desperate. And that someone had followed them. He retrieved the parcel Letty had brought and opened it fully. The ledger's cover was stained with dust but intact. As he turned the pages, a sheet fell out, an inserted note written in a rushed, jagged hand. He lied. About the funds. About the chapel. I confronted him. He laughed. Said I had no proof. But I kept it. He never knew. No name. But the ink was old. And the handwriting, he recognized it faintly. It matched another note. One found folded into Geoffrey's coat on the day of the inquest. A note that had been dismissed as a scrap of accounting, too smudged to matter. Whimsy retrieved that note now from his case and placed the two side by side. Identical. He stared. For a long time. The door creaked. He turned. Mrs. Pembroke stood in the doorway, rain streaking her gray wool coat. Her face was pale, her mouth pressed in a hard line. She stepped inside, eyes fixed on the ledger. You have it, she said flatly. I suppose that's the end of it then. Whimsy didn't answer. He simply held the note between two fingers and watched her eyes as she recognized it. She didn't flinch, but her voice was softer when she spoke next. He said he would ruin us all, she whispered. Said if we didn't give him the land, he would expose everything. Your mother's debt, Letty's forged vouchers, Merton's secret affair. He made threats with such charm. And so you killed him? Whimsy asked quietly. No, she said. I asked him to stop. I begged. But he only smiled. Her gaze fell. It wasn't me. Whimsy stood slowly. Then who? She shook her head. I don't know. But in her voice was something else, not quite fear. Something deeper. The tremor of someone who had told half the truth and knew. The other half was far worse. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away footprints, masking the movements of someone who had tried once again to bury the truth, this time with blood. The villain was still out there, watching, waiting, and now, Whimsy knew they were willing to kill again. The morning after Merton's attack broke with a pale, tentative sun creeping over the drenched fields of Little Whittingford. Inside the rectory, Whimsy sat at the kitchen table, nursing a tepid cup of coffee as the events of the previous night looped through his mind like a grim recital. Merton still hovered in a drugged stupor upstairs, guarded by Dr. Henshaw and a young constable stationed by Inspector Stroud. Mrs. Pembroke had said it wasn't her. Letty had handed over the ledger, and yet, the truth, sharp and terrible still, hovered just beyond reach. There was a pattern. He could feel it in his bones, like a fugue he'd once heard in Leipzig, where the melody had hidden in plain sight, only to reveal itself in the final bars. But what was it? He rose abruptly and walked out into the garden, where the wet grass soaked through his shoes. The village was stirring now, figures shuffling past on bicycles, a milk cart clattering down the lane. In the distance, he could just make out the tall form of Roger Ellison trudging toward the churchyard. That was when it struck him so quietly he almost missed it. It was something Letty had said. I've always been good at being overlooked. At the time, it sounded like the cry of a woman weighed down by history, but now it echoed differently. Whimsy turned it over in his mind, then remembered something else, an earlier phrase, nearly lost in the confusion. He said if we didn't give him the land. But why would Geoffrey Carew want land? He rushed back inside and retrieved the ledger. The financial records were, by now, familiar, but he hadn't properly examined the land entries, the deeds, the leases. Now, a particular line caught his eye, a parcel of meadow land sold 10 years ago to Carew's development firm, now oddly listed as reclaimed property by the parish in last year's report. Except it hadn't been reclaimed. Carew had never transferred the title. Why? Why hold on to useless acreage behind the old chapel? Unless it wasn't useless, Whimsy fetched his coat and hurried toward the chapel ruins once more. Weaving through the muddy footpath, he circled behind the overgrown crypt and scanned the area. The ground here had been disturbed recently by the look of its shovel marks masked by rainfall. A new fence post leaning at an odd angle. He knelt and scraped away the loose soil. Beneath the earth, a corner of tarpaulin, and under that wood, Planks, fresh, he pried one up. His breath caught. Inside was a box, not just any box, a chest. And not just any chest, it was military. WWI issue, the sort used for moving confidential papers or code machines. With trembling fingers, he opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were folders, dozens of them. Whimsy pulled one out and scanned the first page. It was a letter from Lord Bertram Ellison, Roger's father, dated 1919. It outlined a failed scheme involving war bonds, fraudulent property valuations, and a small banking firm that collapsed in 1921, and stamped across it Carewe's signature. Not as an accuser, as a participant. He sat back on his heels. That was it. That was the power Geoffrey Carew had wielded over the Pembrokes and Ellisons alike. He'd stumbled onto a decades-old conspiracy involving stolen funds and false patriotism. He hadn't been blackmailing them for the land, he'd been digging up old sins, quite literally, holding their past over their heads, which meant the murderer wasn't just hiding a new crime. They were silencing someone who threatened to exhume an old one. Back at the rectory, Whimsy spread the documents across the drawing room table. One letter, signed by a junior clerk from the time, mentioned a forged signature. Someone had impersonated a military official to move funds offshore. A minor detail at the time, except he had seen that name before, on the corner of a document Merton had hastily scribbled over. J. Danforth. It was no coincidence. He fetched the scrap of handwriting, recovered from Geoffrey's coat, the half-smudged note everyone had dismissed, and compared it to the recovered letter. The hand was the same. Not Merton's, not Letty's, not even Carew's, but Roger Ellison's. Whimsy's heartbeat quickened. All this time, Roger had played the fool, the melancholic landowner, sipping brandy, waxing poetic over a decaying family name. But he'd been the one pulling strings, silencing threats. It was he who'd led Whimsy toward Merton. It was he who'd disappeared during the attack. A thud upstairs broke his thoughts. He raced up to find Dr. Henshaw crouched over an empty bed. Merton's gone, the doctor breathed. He left through the window, left this behind. He handed Whimsy a note, scrawled and hasty. I know who it is. I'm going to the chapel to confront him before anyone else dies. No signature. Whimsy grabbed his coat and ran. He reached the chapel just as the first drops of rain returned. Inside the nave, Merton stood beneath the crumbled altar, soaked, pale, and shaking, facing Roger Ellison, who held a revolver loosely at his side. I didn't want to, Roger said quietly, the words almost tender. But he wouldn't stop. Whimsy said softly, stepping forward. Roger turned, as if startled. Whimsy had followed. Geoffrey, he said. He came back here digging, asking questions about the war, about my father. I tried to warn him, but he laughed, said he'd publish the papers, destroy us. So you killed him? Roger hesitated. No, the silence hung heavy. He slipped, Roger said finally. He came at me, waving one of those files. We argued. He lunged, he slipped, and struck his head on the altar stone. It wasn't murder. Then why the staging? Whimsy asked. Why the pinnacle? The deliberate misdirection. Roger's jaw clenched. To make him untrustworthy. If they thought him mad, no one would look too closely. He was already unpopular. I thought I could bury him and the truth together. And Merton. He wanted to go to the police. I couldn't let that happen. Whimsy nodded slowly. Then you've written your own end. But Roger only smiled, a strange sadness in his eyes. No, Peter, the end was written years ago. We've just been living in its echo. He dropped the revolver. Merton took a shaky step forward. Outside, sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Inspector Stroud, no doubt. Whimsy stepped back, his gaze still fixed on Roger. The pattern had emerged. It had been there all along, woven through generations of pride, deceit, and silence. And finally, it had spoken. Roger Ellison sat on the chapel's broken altar stone, the revolver discarded at his feet, his breath rising in pale clouds. Merton leaned against the wall, trembling from the effort of the confrontation, the wound on his temple bandaged but still vivid. Whimsy stood between them, coat wet, hands deep in his pockets, eyes narrowing not with judgment, but understanding. Inspector Stroud would arrive any minute, But for now, the chapel seemed to stand outside of time, holding the three of them in quiet suspension. "You said it wasn't murder," Whimsy murmured, crouching before Roger, "but every step you took, afterward manipulating Merton, planting false clues, even the attack at the rectory, that wasn't the behavior of a man merely afraid. That was desperation, calculated desperation. So what was it really? Guilt? Fear of scandal?" Roger gave a faint, weary laugh. "No, Peter, that would have been easier." His eyes met Whimsy's, hollow now, the mask stripped away. "It wasn't about Geoffrey, not truly. It was about my father." Whimsy waited, letting the silence stretch just enough. He wasn't just complicit in the war fraud. He orchestrated it. The letters in that chest, they only scratched the surface. He stole from the returning soldiers the men who'd lost limbs, sons, lives. He made fortunes from their pain, and he made me believe we were patriots. Roger looked down at his hands, as if seeing them anew. "When Geoffrey started digging, I thought he just wanted to ruin us. But the more he uncovered, the more I realized I'd spent my entire life defending a legacy that was poison." Whimsy's voice dropped. "So you wanted to preserve the family name?" "No," Roger whispered. "I wanted to destroy it." Merton stirred, confused. "What?" Roger's voice was hoarse. "All of it, the land, the papers, even the money. It was built on blood and betrayal. I couldn't bear it. So when Geoffrey died, yes, accidentally I saw a way out. I could discredit him, bury the past, and then let the rot consume the house of Ellison from within. That's why I leaked the ledger to Letty, why I let Merton fumble about. I thought if they found just enough truth, it would collapse everything. But when the truth came too close," Whimsy said quietly, "you fought to bury it again." Roger flinched, "Because in the end, I was still my father's son. I'd lived in his shadow so long. I didn't know how to live without it." His voice broke. "I killed Geoffrey with my cowardice, not my hands, and I nearly killed Merton for the same reason." Whimsy stood, the sorrow in his face undimmed by victory. "It wasn't just guilt, then. It was identity." Roger nodded slowly. "Everything I was built on lies. When those lies cracked, I tried to kill the truth. That's what this was about." Outside, the sound of tires crunching on gravel signaled the arrival of Stroud's car. Roger didn't look up. Whimsey turned to Merton. "You'd best go. Let Stroud find me alone with him." "But you've been brave enough," Whimsy said gently. "And you're not the one who needs justice now." Merton nodded slowly, limped toward the shadows, and disappeared into the early mist. Roger took a deep breath. "You'll tell them?" "I'll tell them you surrendered peacefully," Whimsy replied. "What they make of the rest depends on how much truth they want to hear." He stepped outside as Stroud's men approached, the weight of the case settling over his shoulders like the mist itself. Roger's confession would bring scandal, perhaps the fall of a once great family. But Whimsy understood now. The motive had never been greed or revenge. It was the shattering of a legacy, a man trying to rewrite the definition of honor too late. Sometimes the most terrible crimes weren't acts of rage or envy, but of collapse, the quiet, crumbling ruin of a soul crushed under inherited guilt. And, in that ruin, a desperate attempt to be free. The wind off the moor clawed at the windows of Ellison House. As Lord Peter Whimsy stood by the great hearth in the library, his silhouette framed by flickering firelight, Inspector Stroud had taken Roger into custody the night before. The confession enough to secure formal charges. But Whimsy, though exhausted, felt no peace. The pieces were in place, yes, but one still didn't fit. The one that had struck him in the chapel, but had yet to declare itself fully. He poured a finger of whiskey and stared at the portrait above the mantel. Harold Ellison, patriarch, hero, philanthropist, the man who had built the Ellison name into legend, and, it now seemed, into infamy. But Whimsy wasn't staring at the man. He was staring at the frame. The oddity struck him again, the mottled stain along the gilt edge. Not paint, not varnish. Rust, in a room without moisture, with nothing metallic in sight. He reached for it now. Setting the glass aside, the frame gave a slight creak, and then clicked. A hidden compartment slid open at the base of the frame, revealing a narrow pouch, wrapped in oilcloth. Whimsy's hands moved swiftly, the tremor in his chest masked by the meticulousness of his fingers. Inside was a letter, ink faded but legible, bearing the Ellison seal and signed. Not by Harold but by Geoffrey. He read quickly. The truth unfolded. In lines of tight, angry prose. Geoffrey had uncovered the extent of Harold's crimes. Yes, but what he had really found was Roger's role in sustaining them for years. Roger had continued the laundering operation in silence, using family charities to obscure bribes, siphoning funds from trust accounts that should have gone to veterans and war widows. Harold had begun it, but Roger had institutionalized it. Geoffrey's final letter wasn't a suicide note. It was a plea for exposure. He hadn't been blackmailing Roger, he was giving him one last chance to do the right thing. Wimsey folded the letter and turned sharply as footsteps sounded in the corridor. A voice followed, a woman's, calm, controlled. Looking for ghosts, Lord Peter? Letty Ellison stepped into the room, draped in midnight blue, her composure immaculate. Her eyes flicked to the open panel, then to Wimsey's face. Found. I think you know what I found, he replied, sliding the letter into his pocket. It wasn't Roger who set fire to Geoffrey's cottage, was it? Or drugged Merton? Or altered the ledger? She gave the faintest of smiles. Roger had no stomach for violence. I knew that from the beginning. Wimsey stepped forward slowly. So you finished what he couldn't. You planted the false evidence, lured me to the rectory, staged the attack on Merton, all to make Roger look like the collapsing villain while you stayed comfortably in the background. I gave him an exit, she said softly. The name would fall, yes, but quietly, with honor. That was what he wanted. Wimsey's voice sharpened. But you killed Geoffrey. No, she said, eyes gleaming. Geoffrey fell, that much is true. But when I found him alive, barely conscious, clinging to that same cursed ledger, I made sure he didn't wake again. A pause, not for myself, for Roger, for the name. Wimsey's voice dropped, cold and final. You did it for power, Miss Ellison, not honor. You didn't want to save the name. You wanted to inherit it uncontested. Her mask cracked, just slightly. Does it matter? He would have destroyed us all. The name, the house, the land, everything my father built. And Roger, he was crumbling. You saw it. He needed someone to act. So you acted, Wimsey said, again and again. And now you'll answer for it. Her gaze narrowed. Will I? And what exactly have you got? Peter, a burnt page, a confused boy, a dead man's note hidden behind a portrait. He smiled. Slow and sure. The letter was enough. But I thought you might want to make it official. Behind her, the door opened. Stroud entered with 2 constables, their presence sudden and absolute. Letty turned, startled, her composure slipping for the first time. Wimsey's voice remained quiet. You've been under observation since the chapel. I suspected Roger's guilt wasn't quite as tidy as it seemed. You were too careful, too invisible. You wanted me focused on him, and it nearly worked. Stroud stepped forward. Miss Letty Ellison, you are under arrest for the murder of Geoffrey Ellison and the attempted murder of Mr. Jonathan Merton. You do not have to say anything. I saved this house, she shouted suddenly, spinning toward Wimsey. I saved him. If I'd let Geoffrey publish that letter, do you understand what it would have meant? I do, Wimsey said gently. It would have meant the truth. Letty stared at him, fury and despair warring behind her eyes, and then she was led away. Wimsey stood in the silence that followed, his gaze once again on Harold's portrait. The fire crackled softly behind him. The truth, at last, lay bare, not noble, not neat but whole. Later, when the house had emptied, Merton found him there. Wimsey passed him the final letter. What happens now? Merton asked. Wimsey didn't answer at first. He simply looked at the flames. Now, he murmured, now the ghosts can rest. Wimsey had never much liked farewells, particularly ones that followed funerals. Geoffrey Ellison's modest service had taken place at St. Maddox's under a quiet morning sky. The village too subdued to speculate loudly about Letty Ellison's arrest. Though whispers hung like ivy across every gravestone, Roger had not attended. He'd retreated to the country estate, watched by discreet constables, his name spared for now from formal charges. Lord Peter lingered at the grave long after the others had gone. Merton stood nearby, silent, the wind playing gently at his scarf. You know, Merton said at last, I never imagined Geoffrey to be the moral spine of the Ellisons. He always seemed peripheral, like a shadow no one wanted to look at too long. Sometimes, Whimsy said quietly, it's the ignored ones who see everything. They walked back through the churchyard toward Whimsy's motor, but before they reached it, a voice called out from behind them, Lord Peter. They turned. It was Lydia Warburton, Geoffrey's former fiancée. She held a sealed envelope in gloved hands. Her expression was pale, but clear-eyed. This came to me just before the funeral. She said, by courier, no return address. It's in Geoffrey's handwriting. Whimsy took it gently. The seal was unbroken. He opened it and unfolded the single sheet inside. Merton leaned in, reading over his shoulder. It wasn't a letter. It was a copy handwritten of a legal document, a revised will, dated 3 days before Geoffrey's death, bequeathing not his personal fortune what little remained but naming a successor trustee. For the Ellison Charitable Trust, Lydia Warburton. I never knew he'd written this, Lydia whispered. He told me once he wanted to separate the trust from the family, to make sure the funds went where they were meant to, but I didn't think he meant it literally. Whimsy studied the signature, the date, the notary's mark. All correct, all valid. So this, he murmured, would have stripped Roger of control, removed Letty from the financial apparatus entirely, handed oversight to you. Lydia nodded. He believed the Ellisons had lost their moral compass. He thought I could restore it. Merton frowned. But if this had surfaced before, it didn't, Whimsy said. Because someone ensured it didn't. He turned sharply, eyes narrowing with fresh light. The fire in the cottage, the selective destruction. They had assumed Geoffrey's will burned with his papers, but the original still might have existed elsewhere. And if this was the copy, a chill ran through him. He looked at Lydia. Who else knew about this? No one, she said. Not even my solicitor. He must have kept it private. Whimsy's mind moved rapidly, stringing connections together. Roger's increasing fragility, Letty's aggression, Geoffrey's decision to cut them off, the fire, the trap. But then something struck him. If Letty had been the one behind it all, if she were the ultimate mastermind, why send the will to Lydia after her arrest? Why risk it? Unless she hadn't sent it at all. Did the courier say who commissioned the delivery? Whimsy asked. Lydia shook her head. No name. Just the address and instructions not to open it until after the funeral. Whimsy stared into the distance. His mind no longer moved linearly. It moved in spirals. There was one person who'd had access to Geoffrey's records, who'd survived an attempted drugging, who'd remained close to the investigation, but somehow always just outside suspicion. Jonathan Merton. He turned to the young man beside him now. You worked with Geoffrey at the trust, didn't you? Merton nodded slowly. Yes, though only part-time. He asked for my help reconciling older ledgers. And you were there the night of the fire. You said you'd found a discrepancy that led you to his cottage. Yes. Whimsy's voice softened dangerously. But what if you didn't find the ledger after the fire? What if you already had it? What if you were the one who started the blaze, not to kill Geoffrey, but to erase your trail? Merton's face paled. No, I was the one who nearly died. You were found drugged. Yes, Whimsy said. But not fatally. A controlled dose. And the break-in at the rectory, a chance to play victim again. Gain my trust, and you did. Brilliantly. Lydia stepped back, hand at her mouth. Jonathan? Merton's voice cracked. You don't understand. Geoffrey promised me the trust said I could modernize it, that we could root out the corruption together. But then he changed his mind. Gave it to her. He turned to Lydia, eyes burning. He said you represented the conscience of the trust, but you didn't build it. You didn't work for it. I did. You killed him, Whimsy said quietly. Merton flinched, but didn't deny it. He was already hurt. After the fall, he wouldn't let go of the ledger. I thought I could make it look like an accident. And Letty, she was already desperate. It was easy to shift the blame. She played her role so perfectly. I never imagined she'd go so far. And now, Whimsy said, you send the will to Lydia, hoping to clear your conscience before skipping town, or I thought if the trust was secured. Merton whispered, maybe it would all mean something. Whimsy stepped closer. It means a man is dead, another nearly was, and a woman guilty. Yes, was made to carry the whole weight alone. Merton said nothing more. He simply knelt on the grass beside the grave, hands raised, trembling. The wind lifted the last dead leaves around them when Stroud arrived minutes later. He said nothing as Merton was escorted to the car. Wimsey remained behind. Lydia stood beside him, silent. "Well," Wimsey said finally, "I dare say I need stronger tea after this one." She managed a small smile. "You knew all along, didn't you?" "I knew someone was lying. I just hadn't heard the right confession yet." He glanced down at Geoffrey's grave. "The dead have a way of whispering if we listen hard enough." And with that, the last shadow of Ellison House was laid bare under the cold, watchful sky. Wimsey lit a cigarette with a deliberate calm as the police car bearing Jonathan Merton disappeared. Beyond the hedgerows of St. Maddox, the countryside returned to its subdued quiet, birdsong faint in the wind, the echo of sirens fading like a disturbed dream. Lydia Warburton stood beside him, arms folded tightly across her chest, her eyes fixed on the vanishing trail of dust. "I still can't believe it," she said softly. "He always seemed so gentle, quiet, thoughtful." "Those are often the ones to watch," Wimsey murmured. "Quiet does not preclude ambition or resentment." She turned to him. "Did you really know all along?" "Not all," he replied, "but some things began to grate. The staged break-in, the conveniently timed attack, and of course, the letter to polish to be spontaneous, to well-timed to be coincidence." Lydia nodded, but her brows furrowed. "Why send it to me? Why make sure I got it?" "He fancied himself a sort of tragic hero by the end," Wimsey said. "If he couldn't have the trust, he wanted to see it placed in the hands of someone he considered worthy. It was a farewell gesture, or a confession dressed up as redemption." She sighed. "He'll be tried. He'll be charged," Wimsey said. "Whether he stands trial, well, that depends. Merton's clever. He may find a way to turn the narrative, plead diminished capacity, manipulate the press. Or he may simply vanish from public life altogether. But what about Letty?" Wimsey exhaled smoke thoughtfully. "With Merton's confession and the evidence recovered from his rooms, Letty Ellison will likely walk free. The Crown won't risk a trial that could so easily unravel. But her reputation's in tatters. She'll live in exile from polite society, and in truth," he added, "that might sting her more than prison." Lydia didn't answer. They began walking slowly toward the car. She paused near a low stone wall where daffodils had started to bloom. "Lord Peter," she said after a long silence, "why did Geoffrey trust me with the trust? Why not destroy it entirely if he had lost faith in everyone else?" Wimsey glanced at her sit-along. "Because he didn't lose faith in you. Or rather, he knew you had nothing to gain from it. Geoffrey understood that power's true test lies, not in who desires it most, but in who carries it least willingly." She looked at him, eyes narrowed with quiet wonder. "And you? What do you gain from all this?" "An interesting puzzle," Wimsey said lightly, "and the pleasure of making the pieces fit. That, and perhaps just perhaps the faintest hope that things might be a touch less murky tomorrow." They reached the car. Lydia hesitated before getting in. "I suppose that's the end of it." But Wimsey didn't answer immediately. His eyes were drawn to the horizon, the smoke-gray line, where clouds met the fields. "Almost," he said, but not quite, because something still itched at the edge of his memory, an oddity to minor, to have warranted notice before. Now, pulsing insistently, it came back to him not as a fact, but as a feeling, that moment when Merton had stepped away from the fire. On the night of the attempted arson, he'd said he found the ledger inside the cottage, but the cottage had been locked, and no key was ever recovered. Wimsey stopped. His gaze dropped to the roadside verge. "Lydia," he said suddenly, "get in the car. We're making one more stop." Back in St. Maddox, the parsonage stood still in the late light. Reverend Stratton opened the door with his usual gentle demeanor, though his surprise at seeing Wimsey was evident. "I thought it was all over," he said. "Only nearly," Wimsey replied. "May we look inside again?" Stratton stepped aside, and they entered the drawing room where the fire had first burned. It had long since been cleaned, the scent of smoke replaced by polish and lemon oil. But Wimsey walked straight to the bookshelf near the hearth. He pulled out one volume, then another, and stopped at the third. "Here," he said. Inside the hollowed-out interior of the book was a key. Old, brass, its handle smudged with soot. Lydia stepped closer. "But if this is the cottage key, then Merton never had it," Whimsy said. "But someone else did. Someone who locked the door behind them." His fingers traced the spines on the shelf once more. Most books were theological, but one pressed tightly in the corner was a volume on early British banking practices. He opened it, and there, tucked inside the final pages, was another envelope, sealed in wax, not addressed to Lydia, addressed to Stratton. The Reverend looked startled as Whimsy handed it to him. He opened it slowly, read, and grew pale. "It's from Geoffrey," he whispered. "He asked me to hold onto these keys. He feared what Letty or Roger might do. But he also wrote this, if anything should happen to me. Tell the truth only when the lies have run their course." Whimsy watched him closely. "And you didn't think to mention this?" Stratton looked ashamed. "I was afraid. Geoffrey said the truth might only cause more harm if revealed too soon. Or perhaps," Whimsy said coldly, "you preferred to keep your distance. Let the drama unfold safely while you held the one item that could have stopped it." Stratton's silence was all the answer needed. Whimsy turned and walked out. Lydia followed. "Will you turn him in?" "No," Whimsy said. "What would be the charge? Caution? Cowardice? The law has no appetite for moral failure." Lydia's voice was heavy. "So justice isn't complete after all?" "No," Whimsy said. "But perhaps it never is. It only reaches far enough to cast a shadow. Back in London, the case would fade. Reporters would chew it over and discard it. The Ellison scandal replaced by fresher gossip. Letty would resurface somewhere on the continent. Roger might write a memoir. Merton would face trial or flee the country, either outcome likely. Geoffrey would remain dead, but Whimsy would remember, as he always did. For in the end, justice wasn't always a hammer. Sometimes it was a whisper behind a locked door, an echo in a forgotten ledger, or a book left just slightly out of place. And Lord Peter Whimsy, more than anyone, knew how to listen. Wimsey stood on the platform of St. Maddox Station, the wind lifting the edges of his overcoat and flapping the newspaper in his gloved hand. A curl of steam hissed from the waiting engine as he looked back toward the village, now shrinking into the soft folds of the countryside, peaceful once more, or so it would seem. Lydia Warburton, standing beside him, had said little since their final visit to the parsonage. There was closure, yes, a confession, a key, a narrative the public could consume. But underneath it all, the story hadn't sealed itself with the neatness either of them had hoped for. "I keep thinking about Geoffrey's letter to Reverend Stratton," Lydia said. "Why write that cryptic line? Tell the truth only when the lies have run their course. It's poetic, yes, but also evasive. Almost like a challenge." Whimsy folded the paper and tucked it beneath his arm. Geoffrey was a man who lived by precision until the end, when he began speaking in riddles. That itself suggests panic, or else misdirection. She looked up. "You think he was hiding something more?" "I think," Whimsy said slowly, "he suspected something, perhaps of someone he dared not name." The train's whistle pierced the morning air. Whimsy moved toward the carriage, but his gaze wandered toward the wooded slope behind the station, where Merton had once claimed he found the old ledger. That story had never sat comfortably. The discovery too timely, and though Merton had confessed to the arson, the timeline of events around the ledger remained tangled. "Do you suppose he ever really had the ledger when he said he did?" Lydia asked, reading his thoughts. Whimsy gave a faint smile. "An excellent question. The ledger was conveniently charred beyond recognition when recovered. Merton insisted it was an accident. I believe him, oddly enough. But if someone else planted it or altered it, then the story becomes less about Merton's guilt and more about whose guilt he was covering." The idea hung heavily in the air as the conductor signaled the final boarding. Lydia stepped into the train, pausing at the threshold. "Will you ever stop turning the puzzle over?" she asked. "Only when the pieces stop moving," he replied. They took their seats, the countryside slipping by the window in golden streaks. Whimsy leaned back, hat tilted forward, seemingly at ease. But his eyes flickered open the moment the attendant passed, and his hand slid into his coat pocket. There, folded neatly, was a letter. Not Geoffrey Ellison's, nor one found at the parsonage. This one had arrived that morning, hand-delivered without a return name. It was unsigned and contained just one sentence. The fire hid what the ink could not. Whimsy read it again, lips pressed in a thin line. The meaning gnawed at him. If the ledger had contained information, too dangerous to reveal, perhaps the fire had been intended not to destroy evidence, but to conceal something more damaging than even Geoffrey had guessed. A rustle at his side. Lydia noticed the paper and gave him a questioning look. He offered it to her. She read it twice. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" "No," Whimsy said. "But I've sent it along to Parker in London for analysis. We'll know soon enough." She frowned. "You think this is still ongoing?" "Not ongoing," he murmured, "but unfinished. There's a difference." Lydia folded the letter, her fingers lingering on the creases. Could it be from Stratton? Possible. He seemed eager to keep secrets, even if he told himself it was for the greater good. "But I don't think he wrote it." Then who? Whimsy didn't answer. Not because he didn't have a theory, but because he had too many. Someone close to Geoffrey had known the truth. Perhaps not the entire truth, but enough to manipulate events subtly, to nudge Geoffrey toward paranoia, to let Merton fall under suspicion, to disappear quietly once the storm passed. His mind turned to Roger Ellison, Geoffrey's cousin. Roger had vanished from the narrative since the public drama of Letty's release. Too quiet, Whimsy thought, too willing to fade. But there was no proof, only silence and a feeling. The train rumbled through a tunnel. For a moment, everything plunged into darkness. When the light returned, Whimsy found Lydia watching him. "You don't like endings," she said. "I don't trust them," he corrected. "Too neat, too rare. Life prefers ellipses." The rest of the journey passed in thoughtful quiet. When they arrived in London, the crowds swallowed them into the flow of city life. The chaos of the capital in stark contrast to the silence of St. Maddox. But later that night, in the library of 110A Piccadilly, Whimsy poured a drink and stared. At the bulletin board above his writing desk, the case had been pinned and charted photos, newspaper clippings, notes in his hand. A red string still connected the fire at the parsonage to the forged will, to Merton's confession, and to the ruined ledger. And yet, one thread remained loose. Beneath the pinned documents sat a single photograph, a group shot taken at the Ellison Estate garden party, 6 months before Geoffrey's death. Everyone had a glass in hand. Everyone smiled, except for one figure in the back, half turned, half hidden by a hedge. Barely noticeable. Not Merton, not Roger, not Letty, not Lydia. Whimsy leaned forward. "Who were you?" he murmured. "The fire hid what the ink could not." He reached for the magnifier. As the night deepened outside, and the sounds of the city faded into the hush of midnight, Lord Peter Whimsy, ever drawn to the flicker of an unanswered question, followed the faint trail into the shadows where mysteries never ended, but merely paused between breaths.